Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I'm Tamara Pesic. I'm so glad that you could join us this afternoon. Our guest today is Dr. Gregory Berns from Emory University in Georgia, which is thankfully not underwater, not unlike the rest of the Southeast. He's written a really fascinating book called Satisfaction, and he's one of the only folks in his area in academia that is doing anything to talk about this new brain science to the public. So I'm really pleased that he could come out today and discuss this with us. You may have heard him this morning on Steve's Share. I just find this whole realm of inquiry fascinating. It's like opening up a brand new side of what humans are, and truly revolutionizing a psychology and psychiatry perhaps in the future. Some talks that are coming up that you might be interested in is Barbara Ehrenreich is coming in a couple weeks, and Robert Sullivan is going to come in to talk about how not to get rich. If any of you were worried about getting rich in the future, that will be a good talk to attend to stave off that terrible option. But in the meantime, please help me welcome Dr. Gregory Berns.
Well, thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And so I wanted the opportunity to tell you about this book that I've written. And it's a little bit of, it's a little bit of several things. I'm going to stand out here. This is pretty imposing. It's actually a science book in the guise of a travelogue. Or maybe it's the other way around. It's a travelogue in the guise of a science book. And what I wanted to do was essentially kind of translate for the public pretty much the last decade's worth of findings we've been coming up with, my group as well as many others in the field of motivation, specifically human motivation and the neuroscience behind it, and what you can do in terms of translating that into things that actually mean something to people as opposed to just talking about how the brain works. And there's a lot of brain books out there, and I wanted to write a book about the brain but not be a brain book because I thought, well, this stuff is really far more interesting than many books actually make it out to be. And the way I went about doing it was actually trying to take what we've learned in the lab, specifically using brain imaging technologies, and go on this journey of sorts and look at what people do to actually get satisfaction in terms of their own lives, and then use these stories as a way to talk about the brain and what's happening in people's brains when they do these things. And by way of example, I mean, some of the things that I did and got to see other people doing. For example, I got to know people who run ultramarathon races, these races that are typically 100 miles in length, and talk to them and use these stories to explain why someone would run 100 miles in obvious pain and what's going on in the brain that accounts for that. And other things that people continually seem to pursue and we seem to understand or think we understand in terms of what people really want, things like a good meal or intellectual challenges, or even kind of what the nature of pain and pleasure is. And for this audience, actually, it's great because I'd like to talk a little bit more about the science behind this. And if you're interested in the stories, then you can get the book and read the stories for the stories. But the science itself is quite interesting because it was actually, that was the beginning of the book. Because at the outset, I didn't know what kind of book I wanted to write. I thought I was just going to write a book about the brain and motivation and the neuroscience behind it, but it started taking on a life of its own. But I do want to tell you a little bit about the brain and where all of this came from. So can you all see, if I draw up here, you can see it? Okay. So in terms of what the brain does and how it's organized, specifically with regards to motivation, and And when I talk about satisfaction, I like to think of it in terms of motivation. It's basically what is the neural basis of motivation? What makes us compelled to do something? Why do we do one thing and not another? Why do we do anything at all? When you get down to it, that's really the essence of motivation, and what's the neural basis for it? The story actually goes back about 50 years. About 50 years ago, neuroscientists really started getting deeply into how the brain is organized, and very quickly gravitated toward the notion of something called a reward system. Now, I know a lot of people here are familiar with reward systems because at about the same time, with the growth of information technology, computer scientists also gravitated towards the idea of a reward system of some sort, especially in terms of things like reinforcement learning and how animals learn, and then building ideas about how animals learn and actually grafting it into ideas of machine learning and AI. Many of these ideas have become obsolete, but the idea that there exists something in our brains that is essentially a reward center still persists really quite strongly today in neuroscience and psychology. And it's really captured in the idea of what Freud called the pleasure principle. And I mean, it sounds obsolete. In fact, Freud wrote about this almost 100 years ago, but it still, I think, governs a lot of thinking, both in science, but also kind of just in how most people think about what they do. And the pleasure principle is an old idea. It says that animals, and more generally, or more specifically, people, are pretty much geared toward the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain. And there's a certain simplicity to that idea that has a lot of appeal because we can seemingly relate to it. We all like pleasure and we all dislike pain. And it would certainly make for a very efficient algorithm for an animal to operate by. It's a pretty simple calculation, more pleasure, less pain, we can maximize this quantity somehow. And wouldn't it be great if there was something in our brains that actually did this? So this is now this is 50 years ago thinking. Turns out that, so this is kind of a side view of the brain. If you take a cut, that's not going to work. If you look inside the brain, if you slice the brain like this, and you make a cut like that, and then you kind of flip the brain around like this, it will look about like this. Kind of like a butterfly. So this is kind of a straight-on view if you had sliced away the front of someone's brain. And then you would see in here a couple of really dark areas, right kind of in the center of the brain. These dark areas they go by several names depending on how you lump them together. They're called the basal ganglia. Certain parts are also called the striatum. The key thing to know about it is this part of the brain is pretty much the densest part of the brain that has receptors for the neurotransmitter dopamine, which I'm sure you've all heard of the neurotransmitter dopamine as kind of this pleasure chemical. And the history behind this is really interesting because it explains a lot of conventional thinking about how motivation works. Dopamine as a neurotransmitter was discovered in the 50s, about the same time that the neuroscientists started electrically stimulating this part of the brain. First in rats, but later in humans. And what happened was the notion of this part of the brain acting as a reward center grew up because if you put an electrode there, at least in a rat, I mean, this is how it starts. It starts in a rat. If you put an electrode in there and you turn on the juice, rats seemingly like that. Now, how do you know what a rat likes? Well, the original way was just a very casual observation made by these Canadians, Olds and Milner. What they noticed was they put electrodes in parts of the brain right around this area, and they turned on the juice, and then they turned it off. And they noticed the rats went back to the corner of the cage where they were when the electricity was turned on. And at first they thought this was just a coincidence, that maybe somehow stimulating this part of the brain just kind of turned up attention for everything, and the rat just kept going back to the same place. But in fact, they actually were able to prove that the rats came to like that part of their cage every time the electricity was turned on. And they coined a name for this. It's called place preference. And as they did more and more experiments, they mapped out parts of the brain that would elicit this behavior. And it turned out that it's actually a really small subset of the brain. And it overlaps a lot with where dopamine is. And so with these findings, it came the idea that dopamine and these parts of the brain constitute a reward system for the brain, so that whenever something good happens, it's like a reinforcement signal to the animal to repeat it somehow and go back to the same place that it happened so you get more of it. And it seemed to confirm what Freud said about pleasure principle, that we all want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And this idea really kind of was what was accepted for about 40 years after that, at least until the 1990s. And what happened in the 90s was several things. One was the advent of brain imaging technology that really took off. And when I talk about brain imaging, I'm talking about things like MRI, specifically a technique called functional MRI that lets us look at activity in the human brain very rapidly, or relatively rapidly, on the order of seconds, and lets us actually conduct experiments on people while they're in the scanner, and then we can measure how different parts of the brain respond, and specifically the reward system, which is what grabbed my attention. The other aspect was that techniques for measuring dopamine and chemicals like it got a lot more sophisticated and a lot more accurate. As you might imagine, something like dopamine, or really any neurotransmitter, can be released on different time scales. And until about the 90s, you couldn't really tell what was happening on a time scale that was meaningful for the brain. You usually had to stick very kind of clumsy tubes in there and try to siphon off the chemicals there and see what was in kind of the ambient fluid around these parts of the brain. And it wasn't very precise. But more sophisticated techniques were developed in the 90s. And what was discovered was that if you give an animal something that we would think is pleasurable, so if you're a rat, that tends to be food. If you're a male rat, that tends to be a female rat who's ready to mate. If you do that and you measure dopamine in these parts of the brain, dopamine is released, but only the first time. And this was what was really new. What became apparent very quickly is that this part of the brain is not acting as a pleasure center because it doesn't respond the same way to kind of repeated instances of things that we think animals like. And in fact, this part of the brain rapidly habituates. And it's not that it just habituates, it actually learns. This part of the brain seems to act in kind of a predictive fashion. It's trying to predict what's going to happen to the animal, especially kind of in the broad framework of things that are important to the animal. And further experiments were done that kind of pushed the envelope a little bit, not just about things that are pleasurable. I mean, what about things that are unpleasant? Again, same thing. If you take a rat and you do something unpleasant to it, and the usual way you do that is pinch its tail or give it a little electric shock on its cage. Again, if it happens unpredictably and the animal was not able to predict it, you still see dopamine released into this part of the brain. And the notion that came out of this is that dopamine, especially, is not simply a pleasure chemical of the brain. It's actually signaling what I would call salience, or something that's important to the animal. Now, so what? There's lots of things that are important to animals. It's important because the other big function of this part of the brain is it kind of sits at the crossroads between the cortex, which is all of this stuff, and the motor system, which is going through the spinal cord. This part of the brain is really like, the analogy is kind of like a grand central terminal, where most all of the brain sends signals to this part of the brain, and what these signals apparently are doing are vying for control of the body. Now, we all have one body, and for the most part, we can only do one thing at a time. I mean, we can, push it and maybe talk on a cell phone and drive, maybe. You can do it, but you don't do either as well. And so there's really a massive bottleneck in terms of all the things that you might do and all the things that you actually do, because you only have one body, and you can really, to simplify it, you can really only do one thing at a time. And this part of the brain is like a switching station, or it seems to act that way. And dopamine seems to act kind of like the person who switches the tracks. In some ways, it allows different cognitive processes, think of them as kind of different subroutines that are, ready to come online. They're all vying for control of the body, and then, dopamine is released when something unexpected happens and you actually have to shift gears and do something different. It's kind of shifting subroutines. So if you think about it, then that actually means something very different in terms of how to think about motivation and satisfaction. Because if everything, certainly everything that I had been taught about human motivation was geared around the pleasure principle, that we're pursuing pleasure, we're pursuing happiness, and in some sense that's true. But if you look at the neuroscience about it, and you actually try to find pleasure centers in the brain, or even if you try to find pain centers, you can't find them. There's not a single part of the brain that encodes pleasure, and there's not a single part of the brain that encodes pain. But what there is are these centers which essentially encode novelty. These are centers of the brain that sit at this interface between the motor system and all of our cognitive processes, and they come online when you experience something unexpected and you have to do something. And if you think about it, what that means in terms of what the brain is there for in the first place, I kind of always like to pose this question. Why do we have a brain? One possible answer, starting with the most simplistic, is, well, we have a brain so we can survive in the world. Okay, fine. We survive in the world, then what good is that? Well, so we can reproduce and have children. These would be the most general evolutionary explanations of why we have a brain. But taking it a little bit further, what our brains are really good at doing is predicting the future. Maybe they're not perfect at it, but the function of the brain in kind of all its aspects is not simply to respond to what happens in the environment, but actually to predict it, because that is what allows animals to survive in the world. It's what allows us to survive. Because if you weren't able to predict, even if you can only predict a few seconds in the future, that's orders of magnitude better than just reacting. And this ability to predict is so closely tied to novelty that it all comes back to being able to learn. So more generally, what I would say the brain is for is to learn how the world works. The brain builds models of the world. But the only way that you can build a model of the world and function in it is to experience it. Now, as human beings, we have one other mechanism that animals don't have, and that's language. So we can build models of the world simply by communicating with each other, either verbally or in written format. But still, the essence of it is that we have this system in our brain that seems geared for going out, exploring the world through, to some extent, trial and error. And this is almost like the currency of the brain, the ability to experience new information, novelty. It's what our brains are designed for. And so all of this came out of really experiments in neuroscience in terms of animal literature, but also brain imaging in humans. And what the book is about is explaining this, but in a way that I hope is more interesting than what I just said. I don't usually give this talk to most of my audiences, but I think I'm hoping that this audience will like more of the science. But I do want to tell a little story about the book. It's kind of an illustration of what I'm talking about. Originally, I was going to write kind of a book about what I just said. And as I started doing research on this topic, and it kind of took me back really to the beginning of neuroscience, the neuroscience of motivation, I stumbled across these papers written by a psychiatrist in the 50s. His name was Heath, and he was a psychiatrist trained originally at Columbia in New York, and he was trained in psychoanalysis, but he was very aware of what was going on with this deep brain stimulation literature. And he had the idea that he would use this technology in humans, now it had never been done in humans before, to cure schizophrenia. Now at the time, really the only treatments that were available for schizophrenia were lobotomy and insulin shock therapy. There were no drugs, none of the conventional psychiatric treatments that we would use today were available. And this psychiatrist, Heath, he saw that there were problems with the treatments at the time, and specifically he had problems with lobotomy. I mean, he saw what was happening to the patients. And his idea was that instead of disconnecting parts of the brain to try to cure this illness, that the solution would actually be in terms of stimulating a different part. In fact, he wanted to stimulate what he thought were the reward centers of the brain. It was the same parts of the brain that his colleagues were stimulating to steer these rats around their cage. And he thought, well, maybe there's just an imbalance there in terms of schizophrenia. But he didn't know because no one had done it in humans. Now, he couldn't do this in New York. I mean, there were just too many psychiatrists looking over his shoulders, too many colleagues, and too much, skepticism about what he was going to do. And so he left. He went, and he basically went about as far away as he could to an area of the country that he thought he could work unimpeded, and that was New Orleans. He set up shop at Tulane and eventually took over the psychiatry department there. But to this day, he's one of the only people that actually has ever stimulated this part of the brain in people. Now, I didn't know at the time when I was starting out this research, what had actually come of his research. I had read his academic papers, and reading them today, I mean, it's really crazy what he was doing. Moreover, he published it. I mean, you can't publish research like this anymore. I mean, it's unethical by today's standards. But what he was claiming also really was highly politically incorrect. For example, he wrote papers about using brain stimulation to change sexual orientation. I mean, he basically claimed it could cure almost any illness, which is just really outrageous when you think about it. But there was something that kind of caught my interest about it, and that was his notions about pain and pleasure to human beings and what actually constitutes motivation. And apart from these academic papers, I mean, I really couldn't find out much more about him. His legacy had been more or less lumped in with the people who invented lobotomy, because it all came out of that era. And most psychiatrists and most people in neuroscience don't even know of this person anymore because the whole history of that field is so tainted. But anyway, I thought these papers were fascinating, and I kind of bluffed my way into the rest of what actually became the book. I called up the chairman at Tulane, and I said, I'm researching this book on satisfaction and human motivation. Can I watch the Heath films? Now, I didn't really know if there were films of this or not. But I figured if I asked if there were films, and the answer, then, then the jig would be up. I mean, then I'm just kind of some crackpot asking to watch these films. So I figured, well, I'll just bluff my way in, and I assume that there's films because it was in the 50s, and they filmed everything in the 50s. And much to my surprise, the chairman was very gracious. He says, "Oh yeah, we have a closet full of these films. Nobody ever watches them anymore. Why don't you come down? You can see them yourself." And that was actually the beginning of writing this book. I mean, that even though I had been thinking about it for a long time, when I watched these movies, and it's very surreal. I mean, these are just 16 millimeter black and white films, and they were just stacked in a closet somewhere. Heath had been dead for 10 years, but his lab was still there, still had a nameplate on the door. I mean, it's very kind of typical about how things operate in New Orleans. Very genteel and slow to change. And indeed, they kind of preserved his lab as kind of a monument of sorts, really. And I started watching these films, and they were something right out of a sci-fi movie. It was kind of hard to believe that this work was actually done, but these films would start with Heath himself. He'd come on, he'd have the white lab coat on. He was a very distinguished, charismatic character, and he'd come on very serious, kind of like Peter Graves, and say what was about to happen. And then they'd have these curtains that would part, and there would be the poor patient lying there on the table, head just completely swathed in bandages with a couple of wires snaking out. And then behind the patient there'd be just a wall full of electronic equipment, just old vacuum tube stuff with kind of big lights on it. And Heath would explain, he says, well, now we're going to start stimulating this patient's brain. And every time you see it stimulated, a light would flash. And the response to this brain stimulation was subtle, and sometimes profound. And what struck me watching these films, I mean, it ranged from some patients having kind of clearly almost giddiness when their brainstem was stimulated, to other patients who clearly experienced it as some type of discomfort, not quite pain because it's not physical pain apparently, but ranging from this giddiness all the way to the spectrum of violence. And Heath himself, had written in his notebooks that these films were not ever to be seen by the public, because he actually showed them on a couple of occasions, and pretty much his career tanked because of it, because he was immediately accused of brain control. This was also kind of at the time, at the height of the Cold War, and people were very much afraid of Manchurian candidates and all sorts of brainwashing. And he immediately got lumped in with all of that, and he said, well, forget it. No one's going to see them ever again. And that's pretty much what happened. To be honest with you, I don't know. I mean, as far as I know, I'm probably the last person who's seen these films, and I don't know if they still exist now after the hurricane. But the experience, I think, was, it was really quite powerful and moving to me, that I thought, well, there's no reason to write a book simply about motivation. If I can somehow describe what goes on in a person's brain in all sorts of states, then I can make a much more interesting book about the brain. And that was kind of the essence of converting it into a travelogue. And from that point, I decided, well, I'm just going to go see what people do for satisfaction and use those stories to explain what happens in the brain. And so I went places like watching people compete in ultramarathons. I went to Cuba and went to Iceland and talked to people there about how they get satisfaction. There's a chapter on crossword puzzles and the intellectual satisfaction of that. I was lucky enough to spend a weekend with a world-class chef to pick his brain about what goes into the most satisfying of meals. But the constant theme in all of these things that I kept seeing, and maybe it's because I wanted to see it, but I think it's true, is that the key ingredient to satisfying experiences, there's two, actually. The first is novelty, and I think we can all relate to that at some level. In many cases, the first time of anything is always the best. And it's really tapping into this what's actually a novelty center, not a pleasure center. And then the other aspect is the notion of activity. So I often get asked about pleasure. What's the difference between pleasure or happiness and satisfaction? And the way I think about it is that happiness is a passive emotion. It's something that happens to you, whereas satisfaction is an emotion that's driven pretty much from activity and things that people choose to undertake on their own, good or bad. And that's fundamentally the difference. And what I talk about in the book is really how that plays out, the different ways in which people do it, and where it comes from in the brain. I'm going to stop there and take questions, because I know people must have questions. I can sense some antsiness. Yes?
So I've often noticed in my life that the second time I do something, it's scarier or I'm not as good at. Like, it's the scarier time is the second time I do something. Like the second time I went snorkeling, or the second time, whatever. Do you think that has, do you see any relation between that and novelty, or have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, I don't know so much about the second time, but the point, the nervousness you bring up and the anxiety is part of it. And, invariably when I talk to people who are doing kind of interesting things to get satisfaction, there's always this little, sometimes small, sometimes big element of anxiety. And the thing is, that's, what I think holds people back from trying new things. So the example I always give is, we all have our favorite restaurant we go to. And every time I go to my favorite restaurant, I always say, well, I'm going to try something different. And I never do. And yet there was something that happened the first time I went to that restaurant, and I can't ever remember what it is, that caused me to go there, that somehow it sticks in my mind, well, this is my favorite restaurant. There had to be something in that first experience that set that there, that makes it so hard to get out of. And the way that you know that you're kind of pushing this boundary of novelty is precisely because you feel it as anxiety. And a lot of that is traced to another hormone, which I haven't talked about, but I do spend a lot of time talking about in the book, which is this hormone called cortisol. Now, I know we hear a lot about cortisol. If you turn on cable TV, you'll see any number of infomercials telling you that cortisol is bad, that it makes you dumb and it makes you obese, and you have to somehow suppress it. But the fact is that without cortisol, and it's always linked to stress and anxiety, that we couldn't do anything, really. And in fact, if you look at the studies on cortisol, there's actually evidence that it enhances memory and elevates mood. So I think a lot of it is just kind of a little bit of getting over the inertia, and then once past that, the feeling of satisfaction I'm talking about is what comes out of it.
I guess kind of an add-on to that is that the dopamine that happens the first time you do something kind of masks some of the trepidation or enhances the experience enough that you're just not thinking about the bad things that could happen as well? Or?
Well, it turns out the neurons in this part of the brain have receptors for both dopamine and cortisol. And the studies of these two chemicals is that they seem to act synergistically with each other on these neurons. So dopamine by itself has probably a certain feeling. I mean, it's hard to describe, but most people would probably liken it mostly to cocaine, because cocaine is a drug that releases dopamine. Cortisol doesn't really have kind of any. There's no substance out there that really quite mimics what cortisol feels like. Although cortisol is prescribed in various forms for a lot of different conditions. In fact, any steroid has similar effects. So if you take prednisone or anything like that for any inflammatory condition, people will often describe kind of a euphoria that goes along with it. And so with dopamine, it seems that they probably act synergistically with each other. So I don't think that it actually masks the anxiety. I think they actually kind of work together in some chemical way. Yes?
You haven't really talked about finding fulfillment. You sort of talked about what satisfaction is, but what about finding it for us?
I can't find it for another person.
I don't want you to find it for us, but you know, what do you mean sort of by finding true fulfillment?
Well, it's a little bit cliche, but the feeling of satisfaction, in the way I think about it, is not necessarily kind of the conventional way of thinking about satisfaction. It's not, the way I speak of it is more about the feeling of what happens while you're doing something that's typically a little bit challenging and something that you haven't done before. So it's exactly this mix of almost a little bit of euphoria and a little bit of anxiety. It's kind of like a first kiss. And that the fulfillment is, I mean, it's kind of a bit of a hollow title in that there really is no end point to it. Because if you buy into this idea that our brains are really geared toward novelty and not just pleasure, then you step onto what's called really a novelty treadmill. People have spoken about hedonic treadmills, kind of like the pursuit of greater and greater levels of pleasure. But the same thing actually applies to novelty. And depending on how you play it out, I think the notion of fulfillment is one of self-growth. So it's kind of like you can't ever quite get there. And so the solution is to keep growing as an individual and, you know, basically tap into what our brains are designed for anyway, which is to learn about the world. And it's a dodge of an answer, but that's what I mean. Yes?
You talked about happiness and satisfaction as being different things. Like, from my perspective, you mean like winning the lottery makes you happy, but winning a Nobel Prize would be satisfying.
Actually, probably neither makes you happy. I actually talk a lot about the lottery because there's a fair bit of research on what happens when you win the lottery. And basically depending on how much you win, but let's say you win, say, more than $1 million. And there are many ways to win the lottery, not just the lottery. I mean, it can be stock options or inheritance. The euphoria typically will last for about a year, and then people will basically be back the same kind of person that they were before. And the reason is really quite simple, because our notions of happiness and kind of it's almost like a personality trait are probably hardwired. There's two elements to it. One is the genetic makeup. Some people are just born with sunny dispositions, and some people aren't. That's just luck of the genetic lottery. The other element is pretty much being lucky enough to not live in poverty. Those are probably the two biggest ingredients that go into happiness. And after that, it's kind of like, you can move around a little bit, but there's not a lot that you can do long-lasting to change levels of happiness. And that's why I think of it as a passive emotion, because there's nothing that you do that really changes it in the long term. Satisfaction, though, is exactly what I talk about in terms of actually doing things that you choose to do, things that are typically challenging, that give that sense of contentment and challenge while you're doing it. Again, those feelings can be short-lived, because once you're done with something, there's often the experience of being let down and wanting to do something again. But I think that's actually a far preferable way to kind of organize one's life philosophy in terms of doing new things and growing, as opposed to pursuing wealth and things like that. You had a burning question.
Yeah, a couple of other ingredients that you mentioned. You talked about novelty and activity. What about mastery? I mean, mastery is a huge source in all the things you listed. The sort of ongoing satisfaction from an activity like S&M. It's not just the endorphins only get you so far.
Right. Yeah, there's actually, mastery is interesting. It's kind of like the ideal scenario in terms of novelty and activity is you kind of want to be just not quite at the master level. You kind of always want to be approaching it, but once you get to the actual point where there's no further level of improvement, then it becomes predictable.
The things you list, things like puzzles, complex games, being a chef, there is no absolute level of mastery.
No, and that's why I picked those
Right,
examples.
and yet there is definitely a sense of steady improvement in
Yes.
these things. And so, but you wouldn't put that as one of that sense of accomplishment and getting better. So you don't have that as one of your prongs of satisfaction.
Well, it's the feeling of actually making that progress. Now, it's not always up. I mean, it goes down and it gets frustrating at times. Especially if you've chosen an activity that's difficult. But I think we all pick things that are difficult, and I think the ideal thing, if one wants to pick an activity, is to pick something that might be just a little bit of a stretch. I mean, I think we're never quite that good at deciding what our own capabilities are until we actually try. But the other thing about mastery, and this is actually quite well known, is when you get into a new activity, you're often quite naive about it. And it's only when you get kind of past the initial novice stage that you realize, well, hey, there's a lot more to this than I thought. And so it's to someone outside a particular activity. Okay, so let's take an example. This is not really a good one, but say you're into collecting trains, okay? I'm not personally, and so if I see someone collecting trains, I don't really understand it. But you can easily imagine going to that person and immediately kind of getting a dissertation about all the intricacies of different types of trains. And it's not something that's immediately apparent to you, as an outsider or a novice, but you get kind of a little bit of mastery, and then you realize there's whole other levels. Same thing in the people that I talk to, like, cooking, a chef. I don't really have enough sophistication, and I don't really have any mastery at all of cooking to really understand what's going on. I mean, I might think I do, but if I spent any time doing it, then I would quickly realize how much more there is. And I mean, that's kind of the beauty of it. Yeah. Yes?
Is there a relationship between what you call satisfaction and what others have called flow, sort of feeling that everything's going?
Yeah, it's almost the same thing. I think it's very similar to flow. For those of you who might not know flow is an idea developed by a psychologist called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, Hungarian, about 20, maybe almost 30 years ago. And he talked about kind of the ideal sort of activities being in what he called the flow channel, which was kind of this, it's a vague idea, but it somehow resonates in that it's beyond kind of just routine anything, and but doing something that's a little bit challenging, but not so challenging that it's hopeless for an individual. And he called, when you're doing those types of things, that you're experiencing the state of flow. A very popular book, a very popular idea. What I hope to explain is maybe some of the neuroscience and the biology behind exactly what he was talking about. Yeah. Yes?
Did you look at all at spiritual activities, or, I mean, people often talk about spirituality and religion as affecting some of what you're describing as hardwired, that they become happier because of having had spiritual enlightenment or meditative states. And was there anything that you looked at in that regard to see, the chemistry behind satisfaction in those more self-directed activities?
Strangely, yes. And I say strangely because I'm probably about the most unspiritual person around. I mean, as most scientists tend to be rather pragmatic and realists. But, I had an interesting experience as I traveled around for this book. There's a chapter where I went to Iceland. And the reason I went to Iceland was I have a friend and colleague who's a neurologist who specializes in sleep disorders. And he has been collaborating with a company called Decode in Iceland. Decode is a company that was set up by a guy to essentially bank all the genes of all the Icelanders. The there's only about 270,000 people that live in Iceland, and they're all very closely related because it's an island, and the family trees have been kept for generations. And so this company, Decode, was set up to essentially get to blood bank as much of the Iceland population as possible, and then use this database to study genetic diseases. So we went to Iceland to study sleep. Now, sleep, as we all know, can be highly satisfying, and this is a long-winded answer to your question. But we went looking for, I went looking for kind of the genetic basis of the satisfaction in sleep, because my friend actually happened to study a disorder called restless leg syndrome, which is very unpleasant for people who suffer from it and don't get any satisfaction from their sleep because they're constantly jostling around. And what we found there was, or what I found was, a very unique culture that I'm not aware of that exists anywhere else. It's a very technologically advanced culture, very similar to our own. And yet, at the same time, there coexists with technology a very peculiar belief in very old myths. So, and this has actually been in the paper fairly recently. Nowhere else that I know of will you see, kind of next to a company like Decode, a road that is going perfectly straight and then takes a bend because hidden people live in a cluster of rocks. When I say hidden people, I'm talking about elves. And I had many conversations with scientists who worked at Decode, who completely like me, and yet who also somehow are able to maintain this belief, not quite religion. I mean, it's kind of in this weird mix of religion and spirituality connection with their natural world that exists in a very concrete fashion. And so there was this one character in the book I met. His name is Budvar, who worked for a company that makes sleep monitoring equipment. He has a PhD, and he was showing me this bend in the road, and I said, Budvar, you don't really believe in these elves, do you? And he just kind of shrugged, and he says, well, look, the road's been moved. What more do you want me to say? I mean, isn't that real enough for you? And I had many conversations like this with people. We had an encounter with an Icelandic priest there who's basically a modern-day Homer who would tell us the oral history of Iceland and all of the Viking myths and the gods. And ultimately, that journey ended on top of the volcano that Jules Verne wrote about as the entrance to the center of the earth, around which now has kind of grown up kind of a very spiritual group of people. There's no biochemical basis to any of this, because the things that you asked me about have not been studied at all. Do they exist? Yeah, they exist because people experience them. So I do talk about it in a very vague way. Yes?
Is there an optimal window for having satisfying experiences? So what I mean by that is, could you hook someone up to a machine that just continuously gave them new experiences, and would they continue to have this kind of euphoric experience, or would they have to have a delay in between these experiences for them to be satisfying?
I've thought about that. I mean, I don't think... Yeah, no, really. Yeah, using MRI as that machine. MRI, with MRI, we can scan the brain in less than a second now. Technology is good enough, and you could probably do it even faster than that. So the technology is at a point where we can use MRI, functional MRI, essentially as some form of a biofeedback device, but very different from kind of the biofeedback that we heard about in the 70s. And in fact, we've been involved with doing real-time fMRI, and it depends on what part of the brain you're focusing on, but it is entirely possible that one could monitor what's happening in this part of the brain while simultaneously having the person do something. It has to pretty much be through a computer interface because of the constraints of what you can do in a scanner, but it's entirely possible that one could basically through trial and error see how a person's system reacts to different things and come up with some type of algorithm that could optimize it. I mean, I think it's feasible. There are not many people who are doing that specifically, but I think it could be done. It'll be different for everyone, I'm sure. But for an individual, I bet something could be said about that. So many questions. How about over there?
In the experiments you were describing earlier, when the brains of the rats were stimulated, they all went to the same place in the cage, but on the human experiments, you had this wide range of behaviors, and I was curious, is that because of their illnesses, or the physiology is different, or was there some other reason?
I don't think we'll ever know the answer to that, because for ethical reasons, those experiments can't be done. They won't be done anymore. And so we're just left with what was essentially done in the 50s. Now, this guy Heath instrumented a little over 100 patients with this device. And in some, he equipped with a self-stimulator, which was basically a little box, and he let the person actually have control over the stimulation themselves. So every time they wanted a little jolt, they could hit a button and they would get it. But again, in all of the tapes that I saw and all the films and all of the things that Heath wrote about it, he pointed to the fickle nature of the stimulation. And it's probably ultimately why it was abandoned as a treatment, because it was too unpredictable. And I think it gets to the point that the notions of what's good or bad, pain or pleasurable, don't reside in a single part of the brain. Rats don't really have much of a prefrontal cortex at all. And so they are probably a lot simpler. I think they are a lot simpler. Yes?
I'm interested in the notion of the novelty treadmill that you were talking about. From the point of view of, I wonder if people, and I suspect that people can, start to pay more attention to the actual novelty of their experience rather than thinking that, oh, I've done this before. Because, I mean, experiences are novel. They're constantly novel. And I had a really interesting experience last year. I was going to India to work for Microsoft for a couple months, and as I was waiting in the airport the day I was supposed to leave, my plane kept getting delayed hour by hour by hour and finally got canceled at the end of the day. So I had to call back my wife, who I had said goodbye to and all of this, and sort of get picked up and ride home with her. I didn't realize until I left the airport that I had gone into travel mode. I had gone into the mode of thinking I was leaving my country and going to some completely new place, and something had totally shifted in my level of expectation and level of paying attention and being perceptive of things, such that this ride home, that's a drive that I've been on many times, was like nothing I had ever seen before. And my experience of it was so incredibly vivid and peaked, and I guess you'd say satisfying, almost in a transcendental way. I just wonder about, I mean, in some sense that was not a novel experience having done that before, but in another sense, because I was tuned into it in a different way, I was able to perceive a lot of what I hadn't been able to perceive, and maybe I was doing less laying over. I wonder about people's ability to cultivate awareness of the unique situation that they're in order to work with this in a way that doesn't involve getting on the treadmill and is rather inexpensive to a certain degree.
Well, I would point out it probably was certainly a ticket to India is expensive. But that's a really great example, and I've never really heard it described like that. What I started out talking about in terms of the reward center of the brain, and what you describe, is a prediction error. So we're all geared toward making predictions, and we all have expectations about what's going to happen. And in that example, it was an error because something happened that then caused the mismatch. And I think it's exactly those circumstances that caused dopamine to be released and actually probably did contribute to that mental state. Not for the reason that you wanted to, but nevertheless it happens. And it's also why I think when unexpected things happen, good or bad, and when unexpected things happen, I think they tend often to be more on the bad side. But our brains are really geared to adapt to it because you have to. And it sets us in motion, and it sets up a cognitive state, a physiological state in which we're essentially laying down new synapses because that's what we have to do. All right.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming. If you have any further questions, Greg will be here to sign books and chat with you one-on-one if you'd like. Thank you very much for coming out.
Well, thank you.